Thank you, Chancellor Black, for getting us off to such a dynamic beginning to our Diversity Summit. As you refer to your program, you see the topics and the speakers who will be coming before us to share their concepts and to lead our dialogue. I'm happy that each speaker is being introduced by a member of the DAC. So we will now go to our second presentation. Dr. Wilbert.
Thank you, Noma. As you'll see in your program, our next speaker is Dr. Bridget Kelly, and she'll be speaking to us on what diversity really means. Dr. Kelly is no stranger to Tennessee. She got her undergraduate degree from UT Knoxville and her master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Maryland in Social Foundations of Education. Currently, Dr. Kelly is the Associate Professor in the School of Education at Loyola University in Chicago, where she specializes in intergroup dialogue, multicultural competence, and underrepresented populations in higher education. Previously, she was an associate professor in the Student Development Administration program at Seattle University and an assistant professor in the University of Vermont's Higher Education Student Affairs Graduate Preparation Program. Please welcome Dr. Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful way to begin. Thank you so much for my other Tennessee colleague, undergraduate colleague. It's finding all of the Tennessee people across the country is wonderful. I'm looking forward to spending a little bit of time with you this morning and get right into it. So my topic today is what does diversity mean? And I'm going to talk to you about examining diversity and the mythical norm. So the focus of my talk is really what we mean by diversity in education and higher education. I argue that we mean anyone that is different from what I and other scholars have labeled the mythical norm. So I'm going to define the mythical norm, and I'm going to ask you to reorient yourself away from a mythical norm of normal college students, faculty, administrators, and staff, and then another group of diverse faculty, college students, administrators, and staff. If this myth is examined and interrogated alongside the label of diversity, we can move more toward equitable campuses, policies, practices for all identities, beliefs, and bodies. So first, I'm going to share a little bit about what diversity means to me after I just give you that brief introduction. Much like my colleague, I'll talk a little bit about myself before I get into some other research I've done. And we'll define diversity as anyone, again, who differs from the mythical norm, and just define what that mythical norm is. Specifically look at it within higher education, and share a study I conducted that shows how faculty experience the mythical norm in their work with students. To further break down the mythical norm, I will also show a video of students back in Chicago, and then conclude with what hopefully you can take away back to your individual campus or unit from our time together this morning. So diversity is defined as difference. It is how I see myself, how others see me, and experiences that inform how I interpret the world. Diversity for me is situated in higher education. I have my parents here today because I was raised and grew up around college campuses ever since I can remember, and I've spent my whole adult life in higher education. So it is really how I've come to look at diversity. I began, as I said, at the University of Tennessee as an undergraduate. I tried to make this bigger than any of the other institutions that I've been associated with to give homage to where I started and to where I am today. I see lots of orange around the room. So this was a school where, as a woman, when I was there, women could not have sorority houses on campus because they were considered brothels. I'm happy to see that after I graduated that that's no longer the case, but that was certainly my experience in terms of diversity when I was there. I went on to the University of Maryland as a graduate student. Go Terps. All right, yeah, I have my red on for my Terps. I got 2 degrees there, so I figured I could wear the red for the 2 degrees instead of the 1. So while I was at the University of Maryland as a graduate student, I fractured my ankle, and I was temporarily disabled. I was late to classes. I could not get access to many buildings because the campus was not accessible for students with disabilities. So that was a little bit about my experience of diversity at Maryland. At Virginia Tech, any Hokies in the room here? One, all right, a couple of people. At Virginia Tech, I did a postdoctorate work, much like my colleague just shared. I was one of the dissertation people that came to the university to finish my dissertation, and then they hoped I would stay. I didn't stay, but I still had a great experience there. So I did postdoctorate work on a campus with an active plantation on campus that they would give tours to. And I also could not find places that people who looked like me to worship in community and share my belief system. So that was a little bit about my experience of diversity at Virginia Tech. I took my first faculty position at the University of Vermont. Anybody from that small state up northeast? And much sharing with Minnesota, the coldness. So it's good to be here in Tennessee today. So I was at Vermont at a time when students were fighting for civil unions for gay and lesbian couples. It was there that I first began to call my husband my partner in a way to recognize my heterosexual privilege. And so that's a little bit about the diversity I experienced at Vermont. I became associate professor at Seattle University. Anybody from that? See, I've been all over the country. Anybody from that part of the country here today in the Pacific Northwest? It's a beautiful part of the country. So at Seattle University, which is a Jesuit Catholic university, it was where I continued to be the only faculty of color in my program, the only black woman in my department, until I became associate professor at Loyola University Chicago, where I am now, in a program with 2 openly gay white men, 2 women of color, besides myself, one a Latina and one Chinese. So I am just swimming in diversity in terms of where I am now in Chicago, which I love. So my question to you, after sharing a little bit of that, is the rhetorical question. Am I different? Am I diverse? Again, it depends on how I see myself, how others see me, and what experiences I have had that inform how I interpret the world. What diversity means to me. As a student, I was defined as different, to answer that rhetorical question. I was defined as diverse at every single one of those institutions that I just shared. And I want to give you some statistics from a national perspective in terms of diversity, but include myself in here. So from my race, I am part of the 15% of African Americans enrolled in college nationwide. As a female, I am one of 71% of females who are enrolled in college right after high school in this country. In terms of my religious identity, I am part of 31% of college students who label themselves religious. From a socioeconomic perspective, I am part of 79% of college students who earn bachelor's degrees in the US and come from middle to upper class income bracket. From a gender perspective, I am cisgender, which means I'm part of 65% of college students who did not report experiencing physical, verbal, and sexual violence by students, teachers, and staff at their colleges due to their gender identity expression. as 35% of transgender students nationwide in colleges have. As a U.S. citizen, I am part of 96% of students nationwide who are U.S. citizens. As a heterosexual, I am part of 85% of college students who identify as heterosexual. And finally, in terms of my ability status, I am part of 89% of college students who identify as temporarily blind and able-bodied persons. So I'll ask the rhetorical question again. Am I diverse? Am I different? In the context of college students today, I am different than a majority of college students in only two areas of my identity, my race and my religion. The label of diversity yet, though, is set in opposition to the mythical norm, as I'll define in a minute, does not work in my case. The label of diversity was put on me, but it is not exactly accurate, as I will try to argue this morning. And it's not accurate, I also would argue, for the case of many students, faculty, staff, and administrators on our college campuses. Yet, that is still what we mean when we say diversity. So the mythical norm, even with the statistics I just shared, where I align with most college students in all but just two aspects of my identity, as I said, in every institution I have participated in, I am considered different or diverse from the dominant majority. The aspects of my identity that I just walked you through are derived from the mythical norm. And that is from a colleague, Beverly Daniel Tatum, who many of you may know as were all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, or her former position as president of Spelman College. So I give homage to her and use this term from her. Mythical, if you look it up on your phones or in Wikipedia, is defined as idealized, especially with reference to the past, and fictitious. So if we think of, I have small kids, so I've just seen Cinderella and, mythical figures, fictitious figures, but also figures that we idealize. And my daughter immediately wanted to go to the Disney store and get the blue dress that Cinderella was wearing in the movie. So they're idealized, they're fictitious, but there's something that we also want to see. Norm is defined, if you look it up, as typical, convention, standard, usual. So scholar Beverly Daniel Tatum put these two concepts together for society and asked, what is idealized in society? Especially if we think about historically, as our colleague just shared, when we think about the 1960s and before that, and the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Movement, American with Disabilities Act. What stories have we told about ourselves since early U.S. history? Then she combined that fictional story, the mythical, with what we tell about the U.S. with the word norm. Who do we think of when we think of the usual, typical college student, administrator, chancellor, faculty member? White, male, cisgender is what I think. A U.S. citizen, heterosexual, English as the first language, Christian, upper class, older individuals without a disability. So norm meaning what we've come to expect as typical, as standard, as par for the course, particularly in higher education. So Tatum used these 7 categories of identity to label the mythical norm: race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, class, disability status, and age. I humbly added 3 additional categories to her description: gender, nationality, and language. Each of these aspects of identity hold power in U.S. society and in U.S. colleges and universities. In some respects, again, when we say diversity, we mean anyone that defines themselves different from this mythical norm. A student, a faculty member, an administrator who is those categories listed at the bottom of the screen represent the mythical norm. The mythical norm, as I've defined it, is a myth because it is, again, the ideal based on history from a historical perspective, or who we have come to expect who we see as usual, standard, typical in higher education. It is all also fictional because it no longer defines the norm in higher education. Rates of students of color, of females, of non-US students, of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender students are growing at rates faster than the mythical norm. It's also a myth, again, because someone like me, who aligns with 7 of the categories you see on that screen, is still considered diverse, is still not granted power in higher education, even though I'm a very close proximity to that mythical norm. Thus, it's not a matter of just changing how we label people in higher education, some as diverse, some as not. We have to decouple the power and privilege from the mythical norm and decouple oppression from the label and experience of people we label as diverse. So the mythical norm, again, to understand how we must decouple power and privilege from that norm, it's first necessary to examine how when one identifies with the norm, they accrue certain unearned benefits. Power, advantages, access to resources. So persons who closely resemble the mythical norm have unearned power and privilege. So unearned benefits that come from association with the mythical norm are, I like to watch movies, so indulge me for a little bit. Seeing yourself in media about college and higher education. I asked my students to do an assignment that I'll be getting next week where they have to look at different college students' depictions in media, and I always have a few students who say, oh, but it's really, I'm looking for, I want to talk about American Indians, to borrow for my colleague. I'm looking for a film about college with American Indian students. I'm looking for a college about transgender students. It's really hard for me to find those depictions, normal, standard practices. Unearned power to see yourself in some of those pictures you see on your screen, see yourself in relationships that are normal and standard. You get unearned advantage of being able, as that picture shows, my students love that picture, of being able to fall asleep in a class without it being attributed to your maleness or your race, in the case of that student on your screen. Access to resources such as study groups, the other picture on your screen, where you're assumed to be smart and a contributing member, because people don't ask me maybe to be on study groups if I'm a woman in the STEM fields, because I'm not assumed to be smart or like I could be a contributing member, which in my case would be correct, because that's not my field. So juxtapose that to being labeled diverse is to experience, maybe, depending on your context, limitations, discrimination, oppression, restrictions, and thinking about, even if the mythical norm is not true, even if someone just has one or some of the privileged identities that we went over in the mythical norm, one might still experience negative experiences that can come with being labeled diverse. Thus, we must first define diversity as it is currently used in higher education, decouple it from oppression, and then rid higher education of policies, practices, and attitudes that associate people who are different in any way from the mythical norm, as my colleague just said, as subordinate. Limited access is something that you may experience if you are diverse, as well as a lack of resources. So to be labeled and experience higher education as diverse is to be oppressed by the onslaught of questions and stereotypes about why your hair looks and feels different from those in the mythical norm. It is to be, I get some amens from that in the corner. It is to be limited in your career options because you are considered not intelligent, or a college athlete because you look like a black male. To be diverse is to be restricted from certain colleges and universities because your high school did not have advanced placement courses or it was not in a good enough address. To experience college as diverse may mean a lack of access to admissions reserved for children of alumni, to lack financial resources to college and graduate at much lower rates than the majority of students. To experience diversity is to practice a religion that few people on your university have ever heard of, and to be criticized for joining a student organization where you feel affirmed and valued as a person, not just someone who is diverse. So to look at higher education in diversity, again, diversity is defined as anything that is different from the mythical norm in higher education. The mythical norm holds privilege and power in higher education. Higher education was designed historically and still operates currently largely for students, faculty, and administrators who most closely resemble the mythical norm. So if we're going to move away from that mythical norm and be labeled diverse, then we put ourselves apart from the dominant power structure in the U.S. The label of diverse, in my case, also can happen if you do not have enough of the identities or beliefs of the mythical norm, or if you have them all, but you actively work to disrupt the system of power and privilege on which the myth is founded, as my colleague, I think, has demonstrated before me. If you are a U.S. citizen, white, heterosexual, Christian, middle to upper class, male, cisgender, temporarily able-bodied, and act in accordance with the dominant belief system, you will more than likely be afforded deference, respect, and legitimized authority in places that matter, such as in our colleges and universities. Conversely, the more diverse you are or different from this system of domination, such as an immigrant to the United States, a person of color, bisexual, Muslim, low socioeconomic class status, a female, transgender, or have a disability, or act in ways that subvert the system of domination, the less access to power and privilege you have in domains that matter, such as in our colleges and universities. So, of course, I'm a faculty member, so we're going to talk a little bit about faculty this morning. To describe how the mythical norm operates in higher education, I'm going to share a qualitative study a colleague and I did with 11 faculty who teach diversity courses within higher education programs across the country. The demographics of the 11 participants consisted of 7 females, 4 males, 5 white, 1 Asian American, 1 Latina, and 4 African Americans. 3 were lesbian, 1 was gay, and 1 was a bisexual, and 6 identified as heterosexual. We were unable to collect data on socioeconomic class status for every participant. All were U.S. citizens, spoke English as their first language, and were temporarily able-minded and bodied. As I discuss the study, I'm mostly going to focus on sex, race, and sexual orientation, and whether the faculty held power or lacked power across these aspects of their identities. Overall, we found the closer faculty were to the dominant paradigm and the mythical norm, the more power and privilege they were afforded compared to faculty who diverged from that norm. Out of the 11 faculty, 3 discussed tempering their power and privilege in the classroom. Of the 3, 2 were white heterosexual males, and 1 was a white lesbian female. In this quote by Greg, he shared, and I quote, "Students deferred power and authority to him in class because he is, as I quote, a person who identifies with the great many privileged categories and can't be assured that my students are always going to challenge me." Another white heterosexual man, Rick, explained that he comes from a privileged background and used the classroom as a democratic space where he handed out a lot of power back to students to make decisions about assignments, about points, about grading. Elizabeth, a white lesbian, said it is important for her to locate her own privilege as a white upper-class professor and try really hard not to have that overtake the classroom experience. In addition, she relayed, "Students defer power to me. They take you on faith that you're trying to do the right thing and then will forgive you if you screw up. even in ways they possibly shouldn't forgive me. Elizabeth did not discuss any instances where her sex as a female or her sexual orientation as a lesbian affected her credibility or power in the classroom. This demonstrates that the giving and taking of power by students and faculty is complex and not solely attributable to identities one holds. This further supports the falsehood of the mythical norm and problems with labeling some diverse and others not. Thus, where some faculty with access to the dominant power structure and the mythical norm gave power to students or were granted power by students, other faculty experienced students taking power from them. Melanie and Michelle, two heterosexual females of color, both discussed their power and authority being challenged in the classroom. For instance, a white female student in Melanie's class got up and left during a discussion on white privilege. Melanie said, "Usually students tell me if they have to leave early and so on, but for some reason, she just left." So later, I received an email from her, and she says to me that she did not enjoy the class because she didn't feel like talking about white privilege had anything to do with the diversity class. I felt disrespected, also because I started to think again on my position as a woman of color teaching this class. There's perceptions that people hold of me, and I wondered how this would have been perceived by this woman had I been maybe a white professor and a male. Melanie described several examples of the manner in which her power and credibility were usurped in the class. Hillary, a bisexual female, shared her sexual orientation in class, and a student who had sat next to her every day up until that point sat far away from her after that. The student later disclosed he had difficulty reconciling his religious beliefs with her sexual orientation. From that point on, Hillary questioned her ability to connect with students in future classes. So though our study focused on 11 faculty, their experiences highlight how the mythical norm can negatively impact faculty lives. Faculty participants in our study who held certain dominant identities associated with the mythical norm were afforded power, and those who held certain non-dominant identities and considered diverse had power usurped in the classroom. Although nuanced in terms of faculty holding multiple dominant and subordinate identities, those who were white and male in our study experienced the most privilege in the classroom. Those who were black and female in our study experienced the least power in the classroom. Students interacted with faculty based on the mythical norm and faculty members' proximity to the power it holds. Breaking away from a belief in the mythical norm will enable all faculty to be treated equitably. Some suggestions from our study are to expose the myth, talk about power and privilege labels such as normal and diverse and what they can bring, and actualize the faculty experience as one that can be held by individuals with any number of intersecting identities, beliefs, and attitudes. In addition to seeing the mythical norm play out in faculty experiences in the classroom, I want to show you how the norm plays out for students. I gave students in my program no language I wanted them to particularly use, and was not even there, and I don't even know how they did this, how they filmed the video, but I just asked them to talk about who they are, how they identify themselves, and what would they say to you? What would they say diversity means to them? So I want you to pay attention to the descriptors that the students used to define themselves and the answers they gave to the question of what diversity means to them. And I hope my video plays as well as my former colleagues does. It was good, but you may not want to see it right away. So you see why I love my job. My students are quite amazing. So in case you didn't get to see everything, if you're like me, I tell my students these aren't for show. I really do have a hard time seeing visually. From the small sampling of students, you can see no examples of students that represent the mythical norm. Students of color made a point to add the word American to their description. For those labeled diverse in higher education, there is often an assumption, you can talk to our President of the United States, that they are not a U.S. citizen. And with citizenship comes power. In addition, for many of the students of color, they made a point to add words such as college graduate, scholar, educator. They thought it necessary to include identifiers that would get them some of the power afforded to people not labeled as diverse. Overall, you can see the mythical norm of white U.S. citizens as being the norm of college students is false. Yet it is impacting these students who are more often than not labeled diverse based on skin color, hair texture, and other visible markers of difference from the mythical norm. These students are connected to larger movements in higher education such as Black Lives Matter and I Too Am Harvard, where college students are making racial oppression known as alive and well within the academy. Much like race, ethnicity, and nationality are linked with students identifying with their cultural background and not linking themselves explicitly to U.S. in their description. These students are also labeled diverse and often mislabeled because people cannot always tell someone who is Bulgarian or Peruvian, for example. Many of these students learn to give these labels and descriptors to themselves because of the barrage of questions they faced as college students. They looked or acted different enough from the mythical norm, different enough to be labeled diverse. Words such as Chicana and brown are used to claim power in a space that often takes power from them. These students are connected to larger movements in higher education, such as ones that seek to debunk the model minority myth of Asian students. Descriptors such as proud and female and confident women leader convey that these students recognize oppression, lack of access, and limitations that females and women experience in higher education. These students chose to connect strength and power to debunk the myth that females and women are weak and ashamed. Similarly, students who are persecuted for their weight and size took ownership of their bodies to reclaim some of the power that is taken from them in a sizist, that's hard to say, sizist culture. Easier to type, hard to say. No males, I want you to know, no males added qualifiers or language around power or size. It is not enough then for females to be the majority of students who receive college degrees at every single level of higher education. The mythical norm still negatively impacts their experience. These students are connected to larger movements in higher education, such as the Vanderbilt case, where 2 male students were convicted on multiple counts of sexual battery and aggravated rape of female students. Unlike race, ethnicity, and sex and gender, one's belief system is an aspect of identity that is often invisible. Nonetheless, when asked how they identify, many students chose to claim a salient identity of theirs involving belief in religion, spirituality, or no faith. These students attend a Jesuit Catholic institution. If you've not been to Chicago, that is the Madonna del Strata Chapel on Loyola University Chicago campus. So these students attend a Jesuit Catholic institution, and one might assume that most students come to this university because they are Catholic. That is a myth. Most students at Loyola identify as something other than Catholic, and many are Jewish, Muslim, or atheist. Sexuality is another invisible aspect of one's identity, yet it gets a lot of attention for some reason in higher education. Students acknowledge their identities as people who sometimes or always experience a same-sex attraction, people who exclusively experience a different sex attraction, or people who are attracted to people of any sex or gender identity. These students are connected to larger movements in higher education, such as cyberbullying, which was brought to national attention by Rutgers University student Tyler Clemente, who committed suicide after students in his residence hall privately taped him with another male student and posted it on Twitter. While there were less students who noted invisible identities they hold of ability and socioeconomic class status, students' descriptors of these identities showed the power or disempowering effect status can have on their experience. Highlighting being able despite the label of disabled and owning being dyslexic show that students experience the common myth of being assumed less than because of their ability status. Similarly, students wrote about being on the lower to middle end of the socioeconomic class system, but no one labeled themselves as upper class. These students are connected to larger movements in higher education to make campuses accessible and inclusive for students of all ability types, as well as the national call to make higher education affordable so that low-income students can access a college education. I always tell my students, I went to state universities. I believe I got a scholarship and paid about $8,000 a year to go to UT, and my students, the tuition at Loyola is $30,000. So it's amazing. My students at Loyola are similar in conversation with students all across the country who experience the label of diversity as something that limits access, restricts one's movements, and limits resources. It is disempowering to be labeled and treated as diverse, and it sets them apart from the mythical norm, from those in the mythical norm. On the one hand, their answer of what diversity means, as you can see on the left hand of the screen, is what diversity means to them currently. They experience oppression from multiple connections to diversity, such as being women of color, being a gay woman. They experience diversity because of things people can see or think they see when they look at them, such as their race and gender. And like the faculty in my study who experienced a student moving away from her when she revealed that she was a bisexual, my students experienced discrimination because of invisible identities such as sexuality. The label of diverse means students have to be vulnerable to deal with students, faculty, and administrators thinking they are on campus to fill a quota or to help universities report a favorable statistic about who is on their campus, or to be included in admissions websites so universities can appear diverse. On the other hand, students answered the question on the right side of the screen about what diversity means to them by expressing what they hoped or wished diversity would mean in the future. Students want space on campus to share their stories. They want those in power to hear their voice and use it to make the campus a place of equal opportunity and empowerment. They wish the campus to be one that is courageous and compassionate in their love of human variance. In some, they want to dismantle the mythical norm and decouple it from power and privilege not afforded to those thought of as diverse. The statistics that I shared with you early on, the faculty in my study, the students that you've just seen in the presentation, all give credence to the mythical norm being the perception in higher education, but not the reality. When we examine what diversity means, we have to do so by exploring how diverse students, faculty, and administrators experience our campuses. We have to hear their voices and act according to our stated missions of educating everyone, including those who are not part of the mythical norm. In addition, we have to acknowledge that those who align more closely with the mythical norm or do not actively fight against the dominant paradigm on campus are granted unearned power and privilege on university campuses. In order for anything to be a norm, it has to be widely accepted by society, and then it needs to be ingrained in new members. The mythical norm and what is considered diverse has been widely accepted by higher education policymakers, decision makers, and leaders. The mythical norm gets ingrained very easily in new members to higher education by students when they see, oh, well, can I ask who the person in charge is? Who do they see? When they ask who the president is, who do they see? When they ask to see who the board of trustees are at our institutions, who do they see? When they ask to see who the vice presidents are, who do they see? Deans, department chairs, full professors, who are those people on their campus? So new members are also indoctrinated into the mythical norm by who they see is assumed to be full payers of college tuition and who is assumed to be in college on scholarship because of affirmative action. Caroline Turner is a colleague of mine that has researched diversity on campus for almost 30 years. And she wrote a seminal book entitled A Guest in Someone Else's House, Students of Color on Campus. Though she wrote it in 1994, it's still true today, and I would argue not just for students of color, but for every student, faculty, or administrator who are labeled diverse and experience the oppression that comes from not fitting into the mythical norm. In 2015, I got to hear Dr. Turner speak, and she said, guests in someone else's house feel that they can never relax and put their feet up on the table. Guests are not family whose foibles and mistakes are tolerated. On the contrary, guests must follow the house rules, such as keeping out of certain rooms, not touching anything, leaving everything in its place. And guests must always be on their best behavior. Guests have little to no history in the house that they occupy. There are no photographs on the wall that reflect their image. Their paraphernalia, their paintings, their scents and sounds do not appear in the house. So I believe it is time to build new houses, new campus climates, practices, and policies that empower all to be homeowners instead of guests in higher education. It's up to us as educators to remove barriers to students, faculty, and administrators who experience diversity as being guests in someone else's house. In order to do this, we have to disrupt systems of power and privilege that uphold the mythical norm. I would like you to think about, as my students want you to think about, what does diversity mean to you? What does it mean on your campus, in your department, in your unit? What did you learn from the notion of the mythical norm and its connection to diversity? What can you do to remove barriers for guests and empower them to be homeowners? This work takes partners and collaborations to dismantle long-standing systems of domination. Who can you identify as potential helpers? I leave you to reflect on these questions, and I've also included my contact information, and I can give this to the powers that be here, a couple of the resources that may be helpful to you. Thank you.